Hello, everybody, and welcome back to a bit of an off-schedule episode of the Beneath the Red Star podcast, a Russian history podcast for normal people. As always, I am your host, Kyle, and today I have a bit of a weird episode. It is what I think I'm going to be calling a clarifying episode, and I think these clarifying episodes are going to be a new segment within the kind of greater show. And what I mean by that is, at the moment, full-length episodes are coming out every other week. And so there's just a dead space in between. And I think what I'm going to start doing is filling in that dead space with these shorter, kind of more focused episodes. So what my goal is to do is to find things that I have maybe left out, that I didn't expand upon, or that I forgot from previous episodes, and go back and fill in those gaps to clarify certain things. Basically, how this all got started was I was having a conversation with my dad, and he was asking me some questions about some of the previous episodes that I had made. And a big question that he had was, during the events of these various episodes, how big was Russia? How many people were alive there? How physically large was it? And he was saying that, this would really help him conceptualize what was happening and what it looked like. And unfortunately, I didn't really have a good answer for that. I was like, wow, I don't know. This wasn't something that I really thought of while I was doing my research, so I don't have a great answer. And I thought this would be a good way to get that information out there. That way, if in the future you are listening to a new episode, or if you're coming in a little bit late and you are listening to some of the older episodes and you are asking yourself, hey, how big is Russia? You can go to this episode and you can find out. And my goal is to create a whole series of these in between the larger full-length episodes that covered certain things that I left out for whatever reason. These might be things I left out because I forgot and should have put that in there and didn't. Or maybe it's something that I left out for the sake of time. That just, this is interesting, this is cool, I want people to know about, but it is just kind of too much for this one episode. Or maybe it's just kind of a little bit more off topic. Maybe it relates to the broader topic of a full-size episode, but it's just a little bit out there. And instead of giving these a full-length episode, because of course, if it's something that I think deserves a full-length episode that can fill an hour and that I think is really important we need to focus on, I will do that. But with things that maybe are just a little bit tangential and it's like, this isn't a huge issue, I can do this. At least this information is getting out there. At least people will have access to it. And hopefully if they have questions, if they have kind of things in their mind that aren't making sense, I can fill that in a little bit. So aside from the length, I think there are going to be some other kind of key differences between this and a normal episode. The main one is this is going to be a little bit more informal. It's going to be a little bit less professional. I kind of don't like saying that because it makes me sound lazy, but that's kind of what it is. These are just kind of background information episodes that while I'm going to do my absolute very best to get you the best information I can, I do not have the time and I do not have the resources to sit down and read dozens of articles and multiple books to get you this information. So I am going to be doing a little bit more just online research and using some less than kind of scholarly sources. Think, like Wikipedia and stuff. That being said, I am always going to do my due diligence and try to corroborate information that I find online. And when I can, I'm going to try to still use scholarly review journals, books, stuff like that, firsthand sources, whatever I can to get the best information out there. But at the same time, like I was saying, I don't have the time and I don't have the resources to necessarily turn these into fully fleshed out, fully researched episodes. So they are going to maybe suffer a little bit in the research department, but I will be kind of honest, I'm not super upset, particularly about this episode, because finding things like population statistics, finding things like square footage statistics, they can be very difficult to do within scholarly reviewed things because they're generally in there, but we're talking about maybe a single line or two in what could be a 40-page article or a 400-page book. So I'm not super upset. At the same time, it's kind of like these numbers, while they are important and they help set the scene, if I am off by a little bit, I am not going to be super upset because I don't think this information is necessarily vital to your understanding of Russia or Russian history. It's mostly just I want to give you the feel of it. And I think that I've done a pretty good job of researching it to get to that point. So I am genuinely sorry if this is a little disappointing, if you don't like that you wish that I could have better research material and have better sourcing. I'll be perfectly honest, I do too. But getting that research material, getting sourcing is difficult and it is expensive. And I don't have the resources that I need to be able to do that. So as of news time today, this is kind of going to be how it's going to have to be. Maybe in the future, if I have more resources and I have more time, sure thing. I will try to get everything up to the highest level of snuff that I can. But as of today, I'm sorry guys, this is just kind of what I have to work with. So enough of the introduction. Again, my plan was to make this kind of short, and a little bit of a behind the scenes here. This is the second time I'm recording this episode because the first time was over an hour long. So sorry about that. I ramble. I tend to do that. So let's see if this time around I can keep this on the other side of at least 30 minutes. So with no further ado, let's go ahead and hop right in. So the first time that we are going to talk about, or time period, is going to be Muscovy/early Tsarist Russia. This is when Ivan IV is taking over and turning things into, well, Russia, kind of as we will understand it. At this time, Russia is 970,000 square miles. But what does that mean? What is 970,000 square miles? It's almost a million, but that's just a number. How do you conceptualize that? Well, I found an easy way to do that, at least for me, and I hope this is for you, is in Texas's, or Texi. I don't know. I am from Texas, so Texas is kind of, the shape, the size of it, the scale. It all makes sense to me. If you are from somewhere else and you don't like the usage of Texas's as a unit of measurement, hell, let me know, and maybe we can use wherever the hell you're from. If you're from Iowa, we can measure Russia in Iowas. We'll see. So at this time, Russia's area is about that of 3.5 Texases. So it's large. This is a large place. This is, in the 1500s. So this is a time when a lot of kingdoms and such, the kind of big countries that we understand, don't exist quite yet. So 3.5 Texi, one Texas is bigger than large swaths of Europe to this day. This is a big fucking place. But the population is only about 10 million. Well, actually, it's probably a little bit less than 10 million. This is a number that I had quite a bit of difficulty tracking down because, like I was saying in the first episode about Ivan the Terrible, this is a time period where there's not a lot of very serious sourcing and data. It's really hard to get information about because, well, Moscow burns to the ground a whole bunch, and it's like the Middle Ages. People aren't necessarily the best at doing censuses, and even then, again, this is fairly large. This is a big place. 10 million people is a decent amount of people for an area in the 1500s, so it's hard to keep everybody kind of on paper. And that is actually a theme that is going to carry basically up until present day. Russia's big, there's a lot of people there, and it's hard to kind of line them all up and count them all. So there will be a number of attempts to make that happen. Serfdom, actually, in a lot of ways, is related to that, trying to, keep people locked in one place so we can tally them all up. But it never really kind of pans out because Russia is just so damn big. So after Muscovy, we go into the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire is founded in 1721 by Peter the Great. And to be fair, I have called Ivan's Russia the Russian Empire, and it isn't really big T, big R, big E, the Russian Empire. It is like a Russian Empire, and this basically just gets down to the fact that if you're going to call yourself the Tsar, you're basically calling yourself an emperor. So it's kind of the Russian Empire, but the Russian Empire as we know it was founded in 1721 by Peter the Great. At that time, the population was 17.5 million people, and the square footage was 4,633,200 square miles, or roughly 17 Texases. This is a big place, and this is the beginning of the Russian Empire. It gets a lot bigger, roughly twice as big, actually, by the end of it. So this is pretty nutso. And one of the things I also want to impart on you in this episode is where Russia is and who is living in Russia, because a lot of people to this day think of Russia as a place full of Russians, and that is true, kind of legally speaking, in the, concept of a state, way that everyone within Russia is Russian, but ethnically, everyone kind of thinks of everyone in Russia as ethnically Russian. And that's not true. There are large portions of Russia that are not ethnically Russian. And at the time that we are talking about in the 1700s, that is even true then. And it is going to be true for the entire length of the history of Russia. From the very beginning of Russia, Russia sits right in between Europe and Asia and crosses the boundary. So you got a lot of different people living within Russia. And so right now we're at the very beginning of the Russian Empire, and it's mostly European Russia is what makes up this point. In the next 200 years, by its collapse in 1917, the Russian Empire would expand from the steppes of Europe all the way to the end of the Asian continent. And at its height, would even have territory under its control in North America, chiefly Alaska. So Russia is a very multi-ethnic country. And this is not the place to talk necessarily about the multi-ethnicity of Russia. I will do more on that later. But I do want y'all to just kind of be thinking about that this is not a homogenous place. Russia was and still is an incredibly multi-ethnic country. And in 1721, as the Russian Empire begins, it is a very big country, and it will only continue to expand. So the next time period I want to talk about is still in the Russian Empire, and that is the time of Catherine the Great. So Catherine the Great, I can't necessarily say how big Russia was during her rule, but I can say that it was expanding quite a bit. That's actually why Catherine is the Great. Not because she was amazing to her subjects and she really helped people out. No. That's not important. What is important is she made a shit ton of money for the empire. And the easiest way to make a shit ton of money for the empire is by invading all your neighbors and taking all their stuff. Which is something she was incredibly good at. So Russia got quite a bit bigger. I could not find any information about how big it was, but I could find a little bit of information about how many people lived there. And so this is in the year 1800, which is actually 4 years after Catherine the Great would die. So not exactly, but, close enough. That in 1800, 35.5 million people were living in Russia. So in 1721, it was 17.5. Now we are at 35.5. As you can see, this place is growing. People are expanding. And it's twofold. One, it's the 1800s and people are reproducing quite rapidly. As well, Russia is growing a lot. And it is sucking up a lot of territory. And a lot of people think of of course Russia expands so much and Russia was able to, become so big. A lot of the territory that it's taking is practically uninhabited. And that is not true. There are quite a bit of sparsely populated areas that Russia does take over, but I will push back against the idea that Russia just shows up and there's free land. Every place that Russia took over, there were people living there. This is kind of the same argument you hear of the settlers showed up in America and boom, just, oh my God, Wyoming, it's right there, free for the taking. There's no one there. No, there were people there. There may not have been people occupying every single square inch, just standing on it, but there were people there. There were people living there. There were people hunting, fishing, farming, doing whatever on every single square inch that Russia took. Maybe they weren't doing it at that very moment when, a Russian guy showed up, but at some point, somebody was doing something on all of that territory. So that really boosted the population of the Russian Empire. And that population growth and size growth would only continue, basically right up to the collapse of the Russian Empire. I cannot remember where I heard this, so please take this with a huge grain of salt. But I heard once that the Russian Empire expanded something like 100 square miles a year from the moment it was founded to the moment it collapsed, which is nuts. Russia is, you've seen it on a map. It's huge. But even today, the Russia of today is quite a bit smaller than the Russian Empire, the kind of Russia of yesteryear. So what does that look like? Well, at its peak, the Russian Empire was about 8.8 million square feet, or 32 Texases. I really don't know what to say other than Jesus Christ. That's a fucking ton. But unfortunately for, the Russian Tsar and anyone who's benefiting off the gigantic size of Russia, this would not last very long, because that peak is in the late 19th century. Well, as we all probably know by now, in the early 20th century, Russia goes bye-bye. So at the onset of World War I in 1914, right before Russia falls apart, Russia had 167 million people living within it. 3 years later, Russia would be forced to sign the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and as a direct result of that, the Russian Empire would stop existing, and basically all of the territories that were not directly Russia would fall off. So Georgia, Ukraine, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and other areas in not just Eastern Europe or Southeastern Europe, but as far along as places in and nearing Mongolia, along the entire Russian Empire, there would be pieces of what used to be Russia who saw themselves as nationally different, who tried to, some succeeding, some not, break away from the collapsing Russian Empire and the new burgeoning Soviet Union. So as a result of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, I could not find a good number of how much territory they lost, but Russia lost roughly 55 million people. So again, this shows you just how many people are being brought in through conquest, and it also shows you just kind of how devastating to Russia the defeat in World War I was. And so devastating, in fact, was this defeat that basically immediately after the end of the war, the Civil War begins, and it's not really fair to call it the Civil War, because in a way, it's a number of civil wars. It is, of course, the White Army versus the Red Army fighting over who's going to control the new Soviet Union, or maybe a new Russian Republic, new Russian Empire, depends who wins. But as well, once the Bolsheviks, spoiler, defeat the Whites, they are fighting all of these other splinter groups that are trying to create their own countries. They fight in the Baltics, they fight the Ukrainians, they fight the Poles, they're fighting in Central Asia, they're fighting in the Caucasus, they are fighting everywhere, and it takes them years to kind of sort all this out, sort out through warfare, but to, kind of figure out where the new borders of Russia is going to be. And by the end of it, Russia is quite a bit smaller. They're able to claw back, some of this land, like Poland doesn't come back, the Baltics, not quite yet, but they do get Ukraine, they get to keep a lot of the Central Asian and Caucasian territory that, spoiler alert, will eventually become its own countries, but unfortunately for the folks there, not yet. So this means that the Soviet Union is thinking quite a bit about how do we get that territory back. And the story of that is one that I'll have to tell another day. But for now, we're going to go ahead and jump to 1939. So the Soviet Union is pretty stabilized at this point, but it's kind of difficult to get records on how many people are there, which is why I had to jump to 1939. So in 1939, we have 170.4 million people in the USSR, which is only 3 million more than was at the beginning of World War I under the full-sized Russian Empire. And again, this is also after 55 million people fell off of Russia, so it's quite a bit of growth, but population-wise, it's not a whole lot bigger than where it kind of originally left off in 1914 before all the wars, civil wars, mass exoduses, you name it. So right before World War II, there are 170.4 million people. And I'm actually going to do a little bit of skipping here, and we're going to skip to the very end of the Soviet Union now. And so at its peak, the Soviet Union covered 8.65 million square miles, which is about 150,000 square miles less than the Russian Empire was at its peak, but this is still a lot. And this isn't even counting the kind of territories that the USSR had sway over, like the entire Eastern Bloc, or certain countries like North Korea or North Vietnam. So it's really hard to kind of overstate how big Russia is. So here we go again. It's just really fucking big. Unfortunately, though, for the Soviet Union, like I said, it lost about 150,000 square feet-ish. So I had to bump it down to 31 Texases. Sorry, guys. But this would not last forever. The Soviet Union, of course, would collapse in the year 1991. Right before its collapse, the USSR had a population of 289.1 million people. And just to repeat, the size was 8.65 million square miles. So a lot of folks, really, really big place. But one of the things that's kind of interesting to point out is the population density is fairly low. And of course, a lot of that, what it comes down to is the vast majority of the territory within the Soviet Union is Siberia. And while I still very firmly will remind people that Siberia is not uninhabited wasteland free for the taking, it is not a super densely populated place. So this is something that kind of has always vexed people. They're like, wow, there's so many people in Russia. And there have always been so many people in Russia, whatever its form. But it's not nearly as kind of dense as you think. It would be pretty easy to argue that a place of that size could hold quite a few more people. But it doesn't. And a lot of that comes down to that Siberia is miserable, in spite of the fact that every Russian ruler who has had Siberia under their domain has tried to send people to Siberia, whether they want to or not, and it has never worked very well. But back to 1991. In 1991, the USSR has a population of 289.1 million, and the USSR is about 8.65 million square miles. After the collapse of the Soviet Union in the same year, the Russian Federation, which is the state that we know now and comes after the Soviet Union, had a population of 148 million people, and the square mileage was about 6.6 million square miles, or 24 Texases. That is a decrease of 2 million square miles and a population decrease of just under half. So, yeah. For those people who see Russia as the successor state to the Soviet Union, you can see now why Russia's kind of keen on rebuilding a lot of that. They lost a lot of territory and a ton of population. So, yeah, not to say that, of course, this is a good thing, that they should be doing this, but now you can kind of understand why Vlad is so into the idea of, we got to take Ukraine, we got to take Georgia, we got to take the Baltics, we got to take wherever. Because it's not just an issue of, oh no, they've besmirched our honor. It's an issue of, we want people, we want stuff, resources, it's all out there. And the USSR, when it fell apart, well, the USSR lost literally all of it because the USSR doesn't exist anymore. But Russia, as the successor of the USSR, lost a ton. And to this day, one of the issues that Russia is facing is not one of space. Russia has always been a place of space, and to this day, it's got a lot of it. Covers just about 1/10 of the entire planet's surface, well, land mass. The issue is that population. So in 1991, the population of the Russian Federation was 148 million. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, that population would almost exclusively trend down until 2008, where it would hit its lowest point and then start to bounce back up. In 2008, the population of Russia was 142 million people, and like I said, it bounced back up, but not kind of in the way that you might think. As of today, the population in Russia is estimated to be about 144, 145 million people. Yeah, it is still smaller than when the Russian Federation started. And I want to do a deeper dive into the 90s and what happened to Russia and why this all happened, but long story short is basically after the USSR collapsed, there were a lot of wars. Russia got embroiled in a number of wars, kind of like the USSR did after the collapse of the Russian Empire. They want to keep everything together. They're trying to bring Georgia back into the fold. They're trying to keep Chechnya in, and now they're trying to bring Ukraine back in. So, a lot of wars, a lot of violence, not really a great place to live. Russia, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, for the first time, a lot of people can leave. And they go, man, Russia in the 90s is a shit show. I want out of here. And so a lot of them do. And as I was saying, I'm going to do some more info on Russia in the 90s and the collapse of the Soviet Union, and I will absolutely cover that then. But for now, I hope that this answers some questions that people had. Or if it didn't, hopefully it, raises some new questions, and then I can make some episodes about that. But all in all, I hope you guys enjoyed this new style of episode. I hope that this was informative. And if you, as always, have any questions, would like to see me do something else, something different, please let me know. I would be happy to. I am always on the lookout for feedback, both positive and negative, because I want to make this show the best that it can be. So please stick around for more of these clarifying episodes. And of course, please stick around for more of our normal bi-weekly episodes. But for now, I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you guys all have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you for the next one. Bye-bye.